kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to go upstairs and see the exhibition. Is it the volume fine? Yeah. So I start actually with this first slide with a painting by Agostino Brunias. That is, if you want, a representation, a very idyllic representation of slave societies in the West Indies. And in many ways, my paper goes to those societies and think about not just the production of raw cotton that was integral to the existence of slave plantations, but also to the consumption of cotton textiles. So very much my paper links, if you want, to what is 2 or 3 floors above us. But before arriving there, I want to start with a quote. And this is the quote that comes from someone called Harry Pollexfen, who wrote in 1700, in fact he was already dead by then, about the trade to Africa and the Americas. And he says that it deserves all encouragement, being beneficial both in its export and imports, because this was a man based in Britain. He says that this trade carries for us great quantities of our draperies, made of our coarsest wool, so the main material produced in Britain, which would have not been vendible elsewhere, and any other commodities we can well spare, returns chiefly gold and elephant teeth brought here, and great quantities of Negroes, so that's actually what slave people are called, that are carried to our plantations. And so it is hard to name any trade we drive that deserve better to be enlarged. So you realize that this is no sense of any apologies about the slave trade. He thinks that it's quite central to the economy of Britain and indeed of Europe. By contrast, he saw the trade with Asia a bit of a hindrance, a problem, not just for the national balance of trade, simply because mostly was these beautiful textiles from Asia were paid in silver, but also in relation to the so-called home manufactures, what was produced in Britain. He argued, and this is the second quote, that calicos, muslins, and other linens, this is from Asia, are a great obstacle to the improvement of our linen manufactures. Now, the language of linen is interesting because, of course, at the times in which he talked, there wasn't really a cotton textile sector of Europe, linen being the major material. My paper is an attempt to show that Pollexfen was wrong. And in a sense, we should never take sources at face value. In particular, in the ways in which he opposed 2 large spaces and of global trade. India was indeed, well before 1700, and would remain for the next century, over a century, the main producer of beautiful cotton textiles that were not just cheap, but were very colorful, as you will see upstairs, and were traded not just to Europe, but were traded also to China, Japan, and, as I'll show you in a minute, also to the Atlantic space, to parts of Africa, to Latin America, and also to North America. In fact, the trade that was organized by the East India companies accounted for in this trade, Indian cottons accounted for up to 3/4 of everything that was traded from Asia to Europe by these different companies. Textiles were a key commodity in the Atlantic trade, accounted to up to 2/3 of all commodities traded from Europe to Africa, to West Africa in particular, and more than 50% of the goods that were traded from Europe to the West Indies and North America. What I'm trying to show here is to reunite the stories of these 2 oceans that are normally taken as separate. One, the Indian Ocean, dominated by the production and trade of cotton textiles, mostly in India. The other one, the Atlantic, a space of trade in which for no one has denied the role of textiles, the extent, importance, and so also subsequent revolutionary tendencies of Indian cotton textiles have to be acknowledged. Because of the constraints of time, I'm going to focus mostly on the English experience, although what I'm saying could be extended also to include the Dutch, as we were discussing earlier, and indeed also a great deal of the French story. And I will spare you also the good calculations of economic historians and lots of data. It took me about 6 months of my life to get a sense of how trade changed over the 18th century. In particular, English trade, how much it was dependent on the trade of textiles. And one thing I want you to keep in mind, that my story, let's say, moving from 1700 to 1800, has a big shift, because the trade from Britain, and I believe is actually in line with other countries in Europe, to North America, for instance, increases 10 times in size during the 18th century. And of course, this has enormous implications also for the slave trade. So let me go a bit about talking about demand, because recent exhibitions such as the Interwoven Globe a few years ago at the Met, have done much to dispel the assumption that was held in the literature that Asian cotton textiles were consumed within the boundaries of Europe itself. A concession was made that it wasn't just for fashionable consumption of Europeans, but it could enter, for instance, so-called folk dress, and here I give you a sense of Frisian dress. Yet a great portion of Asian textiles were more likely to adorn the bodies and domestic interiors of people in Africa, the West Indies, or North America than actually those in Europe. The Atlantic markets for cotton textiles can be roughly divided into 3 large areas. And as Ellen was saying today, then each of them has a sub-variety. In fact, they vary quite dramatically. There is a West African area, a West Indies area, and a kind of North American colonies. At the beginning of the 18th century, the beginning of the period that I'm considering, it was the African market, the West African market for textiles, that was probably the most complex and sophisticated of the entire Atlantic. I put this image because one of the ways in which the slave trade and later slavery is represented is through bodies that are normally undressed and therefore dehumanized, in a situation in which, if you look at the sources, it tells you instead that the variety and quantity of textiles available in West Africa was gigantic already in the 16th century. And European nations like the Portuguese came to add to this variety. For instance, the Portuguese traded in the first half of the 16th century about 80 to 100 varieties of cloth to Africa that included not just French and Flemish woolens and linens, but also sailcloth and sacks. And indeed, part of these also, Indian cottons became part of these variety of textiles. By the mid-17th century, the Gold Coast of Africa imported 20,000 meters of European and Asian cloth per year. So what type of textiles were consumed in West Africa? Unlike the many Indian textiles for the European markets that are to be found in museums, we have rather scant evidence of what was used in Africa. It was a question earlier on as well. A rare example turns out to be a cloth sample sent by the Dutch West India companies to Elmina, that is in present-day Ghana, in 1788. There are 35 varieties of cloth that were sent to West Africa, including cloth from Cambay, Blood, Salempures, and striped and check cloth. All of these are varieties produced in India. As I said, India was a clear center of production, although what you see is also by this period the increasing importance of imitation of these cloths produced in places like the Netherlands and England. The textile trade to West Africa was profitable, and it was a very complex business in, as I said, Indian as well as other type of cottons. The international commerce, within these parameters of international commerce, African consumers showed very peculiar, very individual tastes, as well as tastes that were shared across the Atlantic, for instance, with American colonists. Both groups wanted textiles, especially bright Indian cloth. They wanted metalware, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and other types of luxuries. The American component of the European trade developed much later than the African one. And partially this might be explained demographically. If you think that in the late 17th century, 1680s, the continent of Africa might have had 20 million inhabitants. However, if you look at demographically North and also Latin America, those numbers are actually much lower, especially after the decimation of local population, after the arrival of Europeans in 1500. In fact, in roughly the same period, 1680s, in North America there were only 150,000 Europeans. That doesn't mean that the population wasn't, however, much larger. However, by the last decades of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century, colonists in New England and the West Indies started trading in large quantities and started commenting also a great deal, lucky as historian, about their consumption. The consumption of Asian cloth in British North America increased following the decades, in the following decades, partly as a result of what has been called an imperial compromise. And this derives by the fact that in 1701, and a second act is the 1721 ban, England essentially stops or limits first the wearing of Indian cottons and silks, and then forbids them in 1721. But this act is never extended to the so-called Dominion, so it's never extended to North America. So American colonists had easier access to Asian cloth than their English and European counterparts. They continued to import calicos, cellos, and silk and cotton blends called sujets, used for gowns, petticoats, curtains, and bed linens. In fact, the prohibition in England came to strengthen the link between India and the Americas, of course, via Britain, as it established that all Asian cloths imported into the colonies had to be re-exported from Britain and therefore purchased it was the classic profit of the East India Company. I draw here on scholarship, not just mine, but also a series of books that have been published over the past decade. I mentioned the Interwoven Globe, you see the catalogue there, but I would like also to mention the books by Robert Duplessis, The Material Atlantic, a very fine book by Jonathan Ecott, and the unsurpassed revision of the original Florence Montgomery by the late Linda Eaton, that is a masterpiece in terms of study of North American textiles. They show that geographically rural markets in North America tended to act very conservatively, relying on linens and especially woolens, and cottons became increasingly important instead in the West Indies first and later on in some parts of North America. Whilst in the late 17th century, cottons were used as rare handkerchiefs or cravat, by the 1770s, skirts, vests, jackets, breeches, gowns, and shirts were all made of cottons and calicos. For instance, one of the areas in which cotton textiles became very popular was Louisiana. Of course, this was also a period of demographic growth, not just in the population of colonists, but also for the fact that you have a massive expansion of the slave population. And this is mostly visible in the period between 1740 and 1780 in places like Jamaica and other Caribbean islands. So reconnecting and reconfiguring the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean allows us to challenge to some extent a certain consumer-led narrative that have positioned European consumers as key to reshaping global markets, especially for Indian cottons and their imitations in the 17th and 18th centuries. Atlantic consumers were as articulate, if not more, than their European counterparts. And North American markets were characterized by complex demand that required manufacturers and agents' ability to provide the required patterns, colors, and up-to-date merchandise. And I illustrate this with the so-called James Alexander's famous samples of 1726. It's a mix of Indian and English copies of chintzes sent as patterns by an English merchant to a New York-based one. And yet we can consider also works such as these, another pattern book, and we move roughly 50 years to 1771, and these at the Metropolitan Museum of Art includes 500 swatches by the Manchester manufacturing firm Benjamin and John Bower, and shows similar type of textiles trade to North America as those similar to those traded to Africa. These were cheap varieties of textiles that were worn by sailors, artisans, and indeed slaves, and formed the backbone of the Atlantic trade. 40% of such swatches were colorful checks and striped textiles. They were not printed. And they were very often made of linen rather than cotton, or mix of linen and cotton. So the importance of checked and striped cloth is, I think, quite central once we start thinking about what happens in the Atlantic. And I go back to the picture I started with, that is called The Linen Market in Dominica, circa 1780, by Agostino Brunias. Like many of his paintings, Brunias, as I said, provides a very idyllic idea of slave plantation economies. But the accusation of unrealism cannot be extended, in fact, to the cloths that are in the picture. Let me give you a sense also of the detail. Because a closer look shows that actually Brunias was incredibly attentive to the diversity of materials that were available. One can see bandanas, romal handkerchiefs, guinea cloth, as well as checked and striped cloth. So Brunias does not show us any cottons or linen printed with floral motifs, and dresses women mostly in this striped cloth, with the exception of one possibly European, surely white lady that is dressed in muslin. So far I've discussed the size of the trade in Indian textiles in the Atlantic, and show the importance of checks and striped cloth in this story. But let me go back instead to manufacturing. What you see is that by the early 17th century, woolens were key to the economy of a place called England. They were the key exports, and had been so for about 6 centuries. And in fact, they were about 90% of everything that was exported by the port of London. And this explains the famous wool sack in the House of Lords, and the many pubs that I go to, like the Golden Fleece. By the mid-1680s, textiles and dress accounted for 50% of the exports of English goods from London to the West Indies, and 2/3 of the export of English goods from London to North America. However, over the 18th century, what you see is that the importance of woolens decreases dramatically, and therefore cotton starts having a new role in this story. The cotton textiles that Britain increasingly exported to North America was not produced in England, but in India. Up to the 1740s, England was effectively what you might call a peddler nation, in the same way in which the Low Countries had been in the previous century, selling Asian textiles to the Americas. However, by the mid-18th century, this situation came to change. And by the 1780s, according to the classic narratives of British industrialization, Britain started producing their own cotton textiles that were demanded across the globe, including by American and African consumers. In the early 18th century, the replacement of Indian cottons with European-made ones was a technological challenge for textile manufacturers. One solution was found in printing on plain Indian cotton cloth or on European-made linen. Results were promising, but there were several issues that hampered the development of large-scale cotton printing industry in Europe. The quality of the printed cloth was not as good as that was imported from India. So in the early decades of the 18th century, the Dutch produced copies. To give you a sense, this is what was imported from India. This is what was produced in the Dutch Republic in the late 17th century, and this is the kind of average product that is actually produced in Europe. So there was a technological issue there. However, over the 18th century, you see several centers of production of cotton textiles in Europe, and I single out two for today's paper. One is Rouen, and the other one is Manchester. Starting with printing on Indian cotton cloth or European linen, and developing their own industry over the 18th century. To give you a sense of what was produced in, for instance, the Dutch Republic, here it's a sample, and it shows the original so-called East India and the copies that are produced in the Dutch Republic in the early 18th century. Going back just a minute to Rouen and Manchester, what you see is that both areas developed a new weaving industry and a product that was, you might say, domesticated, spinning cotton imported from the Americas, and that is the link really to large-scale slavery over the last part of the 18th and the 19th century, and then weaving this finished product that was patterned but not necessarily printed. This remained a small industry in Europe until the mid-18th century. It is estimated, for instance, that Manchester produced no more than 50,000 pieces of cloth, of so-called cotton cloth, in 1750. And this is what, for instance, is produced in Rouen. And you have similar kind of products produced also in the corridor from, you might say, from the Netherlands down to Switzerland as well. Now, I want to conclude by giving you a snapshot in time. And the snapshots come from a book that contains 115 textile swatches of cloth produced in the Manchester area in 1750-51. This so-called album is now at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, and it was created as a kind of rapport to the Bureau de Commerce was the major commercial government institution in 18th century France. Its author was a man from Lancashire. His name was John Hawker, who was a loyalist who had escaped to France with the so-called Young Pretender after the rebellion in 1745, and later became a major figure in the French civil service because he was appointed Inspecteur Général de Manufacture. He was also a bit of a rascal, you might say. I call him the Casanova of textile history, not because of his many adventures, but because one thing that he did was to go back to England just a few years after he left to seek copies and samples of the textiles that were produced there, because that was considered as industrial espionage in order to improve the quality of French production. So the book is really a snapshot, and it includes a series of wonderful textiles. It includes checks and furniture checks, very similar to what we saw earlier. But it also includes so-called cherry dairies that are silk warp and cotton weft. It includes fustian. It includes also so-called Manchester velvets. And going back just a second to the first, it's actually the second page of the book, it says that these checks are made for home consumption or for export, especially for the colonies, and used for sailors' blouses, children's clothing, and linings. It's exactly the type of cloth I was talking about earlier. A project for the publication of a facsimile is underway by Ariane Feneteau and John Stiles. The analysis of the fiber is equally informing because it shows that 2/3 of the Manchester production was actually made not of cotton, but of mixes of cotton and linen. For instance, this is the microscopic vision of the so-called figure number 7, that is the third down the line, that shows that what you see as the small, I think I have a pointer, as these small yarns are made of linen, while the fluffier bits are made of cotton. And that's a so-called fustian, so it's a mixed linen and cotton. And as you can see, the parts in color are actually made of cotton, and there is a reason for that, because cotton absorbs dyes much better than linen. And so in a product that is a mix of the two, is you might say, nearly there being a cotton textiles. Actually, this is what you do. You put the more expensive cotton, because raw cotton is more expensive than linen, but you only put a certain amount of it, and especially the parts that have to be colorful. This, I think, is quite a nice way to think about objects, not in just what we see, but also what can be seen from a microscopic analysis. Because it tells you a story in which essentially the rise of the cotton industry in Europe turns out to be cut to size in two ways. One is the fact that it really doesn't start in the 1770s, 1780s, but it starts much earlier. And it is not necessarily a story of printing only, but it is a story also weaving this type of cloth. And the other aspect is that the story becomes less about Europe and what Europe did or did not, and in creating a new narrative of industrialization, but relies instead on the role of global markets, in particular, as I try to convince you, the markets in the Atlantic. So, in conclusion, sorry, this is the fluffier bit of another one, I forgot. In this paper, I've mapped the connection between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean in the period between roughly 1650 to 1800. Cotton textiles produced in India formed a very important part of the trade that was carried out by Europeans in places like West Africa, the West Indies, and in North America. And yet the expanding Atlantic markets created opportunities for the development of a new industry in Europe that was in imitation of Indian products. It was not the well-known calico printing industry, but it was a somewhat more minor checks and striped industry that catered specifically for the African and American consumers. It emerged in areas such as Manchester, Rouen, and other parts, as we've seen also in the Netherlands. And over the course of a generation between the 1740s and 1780s, it expanded to become a rather important European industry. It was therefore the competition, you might say, against Indian cloth, and also the potential of Atlantic markets supported by slavery that created a new product in Europe. And we might want to reflect on the moral as well as the economic consequences of all of this. Thank you very much.